There is nothing new in the world except the history you do not know. Welcome to the Sales History Podcast. I'm your host, narrator, nerd, Todd Caponi. All right, let's have some fun today. So far, I've told you a couple of the stories that I find really, really interesting from sales history's past that we don't often hear about. Well, today, let's do a bit of a summary. I want to tell you the history of sales. However, you can find articles on that anywhere. I'm going to take a different perspective on it. A few weeks ago, I was reading a book from 1920, so 101 years ago, called Personal Selling by an individual named Wesley Stager. In it, in chapter 1, he tells the history of sales. And so I thought, wouldn't it be fun for us to just go through and talk a little bit about the history of sales from the perspective of somebody telling the history of sales 101 years ago. Like, how cool is that? So here's the thing. When you think about how long the profession of sales has been around in a similar structure to how it is today, how far back would you go? I mean, scroll your LinkedIn timeline, and most posts write as though the profession has really only just begun, or that it's evolving so quickly that the current form is so different than it was before, or that the profession itself didn't actually come to be until the 1930s. Well, those are all wrong. I mean, I've obviously been evidence of this from the books that I'm reading and the research that I'm doing. But, for example, the typical first book referred to that has to do with sales ever really mentioned is Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People, which was published in October of 1936. That book is a classic. There is no doubt about it. However, the ideas of that book were written about by countless other authors in countless other books way before 1936. So here it is. I'm going to give you the history of sales from the perspective of Personal Selling's author, Wesley Stager. And it's timeless, and I think it's pretty accurate from what I found. Now, he starts off by talking about this idea that the business of selling is still in its cradle close, he calls it. And here we are, 101 years later, 2021, and I still believe that to be true. I mean, the profession does evolve as we learn as a people and as a society and as circumstances change and as technologies change, of course. But here is my retelling of the history of sales through 1920 as told by Wesley Stager. So let's start from the beginning. And he goes all the way back. I mean, he begins his explanation by taking us all the way back to the beginning of time, where we as human beings were deriving our sustenance from the earth, eating what we could eat and taming wild animals. Now, over time, we began to understand that we could actually cultivate the earth, right? Take the resources and make it produce more abundantly. Now, at the time, there were groups and tribes that were learning this, but some faster than others. And as human beings began to mingle with others, there was a realization that hey, some could secure and produce better than others, which caused stronger tribes to simply take from weaker tribes. So survival, longevity, and security came at the price of essentially fighting in war every single time. The mingling of these tribes started to take the form of interchanging ideas and sometimes exchanging what they had produced. I mean, some tribes were good at some things, some tribes were good at others. The weaker tribes were learning from their conquerors and quickly realized that exchanges could take place without war. Stanger says, quote, man had begun to place values, to mean that human beings figured out what value a produced item could hold and what it could be traded for, and thus, quote, the embryo salesman made his appearance on earth. Now, as the idea of trading grew, values were placed on what you had and what you wanted. It's what you did. Because the actualization of trade meant that tribes didn't have to produce everything for themselves in order to survive, people began to divide into specializations. So there was hunters and agriculturalists and shepherds and fishermen, all producing what others needed which essentially gave rise to a form of commerce. Soon after, labor began to also have a value, which spawned the rise of tradesmen and specialists, like expert cave builders or hut makers, armorers or producers of arrowheads, stone knives, or other instruments. Stanger states that, quote, once man had progressed past food and shelter, things became more complex. He went on to say that it was no longer just needs that were now a market. There was also a market for wants, too. How could values be established for so many things? Well, eventually, values became expressed in items. Mensuration, which is like measuring, weights, measures, which led to the birth of currency. So picture this for a second. You need something that you're not able to produce yourself. What do? Well, maybe you've bred some livestock that you're willing to trade. So you wander around trying to find someone who has what you need, then offer your surplus livestock for it. Like that's what you would do. But obviously this created a problem which led to trade events where people met at regular intervals and at stated places. You brought what you had produced, raised, or accumulated, then made trades. At the time then, everyone was a salesperson, and essentially everyone was a buyer too. And this was the way that things took place for centuries. As complexities and offers grew, so did the necessity of attention to the producers of goods to their crafts, allowing for very little time to trade. Meaning, if you were producing something, you needed to be spending time on that. I mean, the time it would take to trade took forever, right? So with this, there was another evolution born, which was the intermediary or the middleman or the merchant salesperson. So this either took the form of a definitively located store, and Stanger goes on to define them as a salesman who had nothing of his own production to sell, but who sold for the others who did produce and charged for his labor. So it's like a store where if you had purchased something, you would potentially take it to this merchant salesperson or this intermediary or middleman, and they would have a store set up and they would almost co-sign sell. Now, merchants allowed farmers to farm, artisans to spend all their time at their benches, and manufacturers to manufacture. Specialists and professionals could devote their time to their craft, and those intermediaries became the means of exchange. This level of complexity and organization led to a need for more challenges, more responsibility, more delegation required. A merchant would need to dispose of goods that had accumulated but had not yet sold in the store itself, and thus a need for a salesperson to go out and sell these things. Similar to how today we can't just build a store or an e-commerce site and expect people to show up and buy everything. Salespeople were hired to bring the surplus goods out to market, to educate. The merchant dealt with the producer, and the people whom he delegated the distribution dealt with the consumer. That was the salesperson. Now, that's where Stanger left off. I want to pick up in a 1923 book by Harold Whitehead called The Business of Selling. And in it, Whitehead describes this distribution by proclaiming that, quote, houses, horseshoes, ink, insurance, and all kinds of commodities can be passed from one person or firm to another only by the work of salesmen. And again, as we've talked about in previous episodes, salesman was a broad term that really encompassed everybody. And the role of saleswoman was certainly prominent. But these authors at the time felt the use of multiple pronouns was confusing, and so they just stuck to salesman. Now, Whitehead takes us forward to a time when travel began to become more pervasive, and salespeople had the means to more easily represent the merchants who sold on behalf of the producers across a greater landscape. These earlier traveling salesmen, who were referred to as drummers, as Whitehead describes, business did not have the same moral quality that it possesses today. Essentially, a drummer judged their own success by merely how much they sold. If they sold goods that weren't of value to a customer, that didn't trouble the drummer. In most instances, the drummer would never know of any issue or injury to the customer. Like, how are you going to share? There's no 800 number. Can't really write a letter and have anybody actually be held accountable for the mis-selling of goods. As Stanger adds, going back to his book, to be a salesman at the time, it was supposed that a man had to carry about so much hard liquor with him, and that the best salesman was the man who skinned the buyer the closest. He added that those qualifications have no place in the profession at all now. Harold Whitehead captures the sentiment of the professional salesperson in 1923 by saying, quote, "The traveling salesman of today does all in his power to help the business of his customers grow. For the more prosperous they become, the more merchandise he can sell him." Now, going back to the last episode, again, at the time, sales was not only trusted and respected, it was admired, because when salespeople helped their customers grow, the whole economy grew and everyone was uplifted by it. In Whitehead's opinion, salesmen were here before we had lawyers and doctors. Salesmen were here before we had government. People demanded relief from disagreement and a regulation of action, and thus became lawyers. People required relief from bodily ills, and there became doctors. People demanded a means of disposing of surplus goods, a method of exchange of values, a leveling of the accumulation of visible wealth, and there became salespeople. So, 100 years ago, like I said, it was not only trusted and respected, it was also admired. These salespeople selling the right products to the right customers at the right time, solely focused on those customer successes, rose everyone up. And as Stanger so eloquently puts it, the salesperson is possibly the most important link in the entire plan of modern civilization. Like, how awesome is that? So I'll leave you with this last Wesley Stager quote from the book, again, written in 1920. He says, quote, "Sales is the livest profession there is. It is the one profession that daily abandons the precedents of yesterday and makes new ones for new situations." So there you have it, the true history of sales told 100 years ago. And at the beginning, my little quote at the beginning about, there's nothing new except for the history you do not know. It's just so cool to think about 100 years ago, somebody was sitting there saying, gosh, I wonder what the history of our profession is. And to have it resonate so strongly even today, 100 years after that sales history lesson was taught, is pretty amazing to me. So thanks again for listening. I hope you found it fun, enjoyable, something that you can use. And again, keep sharing, keep giving me your feedback, and keep listening in. More stuff coming, including in the next episode. My intention is one around some crazy science that they used back in the 1910s and 1920s as a sales philosophy. It is so interesting, and I can't wait to share it with you. So thanks again.